15th of September, 1940. Over the Kent countryside at 21,000 feet, the Spitfire shudders. Squadron leader Brian Lane squeezes the firing button. 8 Browning machine guns chatter for precisely 2 seconds before his ammunition runs dry. Tracer rounds streak towards the Heinkel bomber ahead, stitching across its fuselage like threads on fabric. 160 bullets per second. The gunfire sounds impressive, feels powerful, but the Heinkel doesn't falter. It doesn't even slow down. Lane watches, incredulous, as the massive bomber simply absorbs the punishment and maintains formation. He can see the holes in its skin, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. The German bomber flies on regardless, its self-sealing fuel tanks doing exactly what they were designed to do. Its armored protection shielding the crew from rifle-caliber rounds that had seemed so formidable just months before. Lane breaks away, fuel low, ammunition exhausted, target undamaged. On the ground, intelligence officers will later count over 200 .303 hits on German bombers that made it home that day. The arithmetic was becoming impossible to ignore. Britain's fighter pilots were running out of bullets before they could run out of targets. Something had to change. That something was a French-designed weapon that would transform British fighter aircraft from mere irritants into lethal predators. Within 3 years, it would become the standard armament of every RAF fighter, the weapon that would allow a single burst to achieve what hundreds of machine gun rounds could not. The problem was brutally simple. Aircraft outgrew their weapons. Throughout the 1930s, RAF planners had watched with growing concern as bomber construction became increasingly sophisticated. Metal stressed skin fuselages replaced fabric-covered frames. Self-sealing fuel tanks, developed from rubber compounds that swelled when exposed to petrol, could absorb dozens of punctures. Armored plating protected pilots and vital components. The Luftwaffe's Heinkel 111, Dornier Do-17, and Junkers Ju-88 bombers weren't merely resistant to rifle-caliber fire, they were practically immune to it. The 8 .303 Browning machine guns mounted in Hurricane and Spitfire wings had been chosen in the mid-1930s based on a straightforward calculation. Volume of fire would compensate for relatively weak individual rounds. Each gun fired roughly 1,150 rounds per minute. 8 guns meant 1,600 bullets per second. The theory assumed these rounds, harmonized to converge at 400 yards, would saturate an enemy aircraft with sufficient hits to bring it down. Reality proved otherwise. Pre-war tests in 1939 using .303 armor-piercing ammunition against a Blenheim's fuselage and rear gunner armor plate yielded devastating results. Just 6% penetration at 200 yards against self-sealing fuel tanks. Standard incendiary rounds ignited fuel on only 1 shot in 10. Even the improved DeWilde incendiary, which flashed brilliantly on impact, managed only 1 ignition in 5 attempts. Battle experience confirmed what the tests suggested. German bombers routinely returned to base with 200 .303 hits, some limped home with more. The small-caliber rounds simply lacked the energy to penetrate and destroy. They could wound aircraft, but struggled to kill them. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, by contrast, mounted 2 20mm MGFF cannons and 2 .792mm machine guns. The cannon shells, though fired at a relatively modest 530 rounds per minute, contained explosive charges. A single hit could accomplish what dozens of machine gun rounds could not. The weight of fire from a Bf-109's weapons in a 3-second burst amounted to roughly 18 pounds of ordnance. The Spitfire's 8 machine guns firing for the same duration delivered 13 pounds. But the real disparity wasn't in weight, it was in effect. Explosive shells didn't merely puncture, they detonated. The RAF had recognized this vulnerability years before war began. In the late 1930s, they had considered American .50 caliber heavy machine guns, but rejected them as offering insufficient improvement over the .303. If they were going to upgrade, they reasoned, it had to be to something genuinely transformative. They needed cannon. Specifically, they needed cannon that could be mounted in fighter wings, fired at high rates, and reliably penetrate enemy armor before detonating inside the target. The solution arrived from an unexpected source: a Swiss designer working in France. Marc Berthiet, the brilliant engineer who had created the legendary Hispano V12 aero engines, turned his attention to weaponry in the early 1930s. His starting point was the Swiss Oerlikon FFS cannon, itself descended from the German Becker gun of the First World War. But Berthiet wasn't interested in mere adaptation. He wanted fundamental redesign. The result, patented in 1938, was the Hispano HS404. In British service, it would become simply the Hispano cannon. The genius of Berthiet's design lay in his gas-operated system. Unlike the simple blowback mechanism of the Oerlikon, which required a heavy bolt to contain chamber pressure, the Hispano used a locked breech that opened only after the projectile had passed a gas port roughly halfway down the barrel. High-pressure propellant gas bled through this port, driving a piston that unlocked the bolt through a cam mechanism. Only then did the remaining pressure drive the bolt rearward, extracting and ejecting the spent case whilst compressing a recoil spring. The system was mechanically elegant and practically advantageous. The locked breech meant the bolt could be far lighter than a blowback design, permitting a rate of fire approaching 700 rounds per minute, roughly 200 rounds faster than the Oerlikon and substantially quicker than the German MGFF's 530 rounds per minute. The projectile itself measured 20 millimeters in diameter and 110 millimeters in length, fired from a cartridge case 110 millimeters long. Muzzle velocity exceeded 850 meters per second, roughly 2,800 feet per second, about twice the speed of sound. This velocity wasn't merely impressive, it was tactically essential. Higher velocity meant flatter trajectory, which translated to greater accuracy and improved penetration. The complete weapon measured approximately 2.36 meters in length and weighed 42 kilograms. Not dramatically heavier than a .50 caliber Browning machine gun, yet firing a projectile with nearly 40 times the weight and many times the destructive capacity. Early production models used a 60-round drum magazine mounted on the weapon's side. This drum, whilst compact enough to fit within a fighter wing, imposed its own limitations. Changing drums in flight was impossible in single-seat fighters and perilous even in twin-engine aircraft with crew access. The restricted capacity meant pilots had roughly 8 seconds of continuous fire, enough for perhaps 3 or 4 carefully aimed bursts before running dry. British engineers at the British Manufacture and Research Company, universally known as BMARCO, immediately recognized this weakness and set about developing a belt feed mechanism. Martin Baker, better known for ejection seats, designed the system that would become standard. The belt feed, adopted as part of the Hispano Mark II in 1941, transformed the weapon's utility. A Spitfire could now carry 120 rounds per gun, doubling its effective combat persistence. A Hurricane with 4 cannon could carry similar loads. Night fighters, like the Beaufighter, with space for larger ammunition bays, could carry substantially more. The ammunition itself came in several variants, each designed for specific tactical purposes. High explosive rounds contained roughly 10 grams of tetril, sufficient to shatter structural components or detonate fuel vapor. Semi-armor-piercing incendiary combined a hardened penetrator with 9 grams of incendiary compound, designed to punch through light armor before igniting what lay beyond.
High explosive incendiary mixed 7 grams of tetryl with 4 grams of incendiary, less explosive power than pure HE, but adding the crucial ability to start fires in fuel systems, hydraulics, and oil tanks.
Pilots could request specific loads, though most flew with mixed belts, combining all 3 types. Production presented extraordinary challenges. The weapon had been designed using metric measurements. British industry operated in imperial units. Every dimension had to be converted, every tolerance recalculated. Dies had to be cut, gauges manufactured, supply chains established for components that didn't exist in British inventory. BMAR Co., purpose-built in Grantham, Lincolnshire, under the Air Ministry's Shadow Factory scheme, bore the brunt of early production. By 1943, the facility and its satellite plant produced 46% of Britain's Hispano cannon output. The Birmingham Small Arms Company's Shadow Factory at Newcastle-under-Lyme contributed 25%. The Royal Ordnance Factory at Poole added another 25%. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield supplied the remaining 3%. Exact production numbers remain classified, but by the end of the war, British factories had manufactured the cannon in quantities sufficient to completely rearm Fighter Command and re-equip bomber defensive positions. Conservative estimates suggest production exceeded 100,000 units, though the true figure may be substantially higher. The Grantham facility alone produced 5 million rounds of ammunition and 100,000 cannon shells by 1945. The weapon's importance to the war effort made BMAR Co. itself a target. The Luftwaffe raided Grantham 21 times between 1941 and 1942, killing 88 people in deliberate attempts to disrupt production. One raid on the 9th of January 1941 killed 22 people on Commercial Road with 29 high-explosive bombs. The deep-hole boring machine used for drilling cannon barrels, recovered from occupied France in a daring lorry journey in 1940, was considered so vital it was housed in a specially constructed bomb-proof shelter. Production never stopped. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Operational introduction proved frustrating. A small number of Spitfire Mk2 received Hispano cannon during the final stages of the Battle of Britain in late 1940. The results were catastrophic, though not for reasons Burkitt could have anticipated. The French gun had been designed to be mounted rigidly on a massive engine block, firing through the propeller shaft as a motor cannon. British engineers attempting to mount the weapon in flexible fighter wings, and moreover, mounting them on their sides to accommodate the drum magazines within the wing profile, created conditions the weapon simply couldn't tolerate. The guns jammed constantly, frequently after only a single round. Pilots who had eagerly anticipated the new firepower demanded their old 8-gun Spitfires back. The solution required patient engineering. Guns mounted in the more rigid fuselages of aircraft like the Westland Whirlwind, Bristol Beaufighter, and de Havilland Mosquito performed far better. Wing-mounted installations improved dramatically once engineers abandoned the sideways mounting, strengthened the mounting points, and developed the belt feed system that eliminated the problematic drums. By mid-1941, the Hispano Mk2 had become reliable enough for widespread deployment. The Hurricane Mk2C, mounting 4 cannon, entered service as a ground attack aircraft. Tropical variants of the Spitfire received 4 cannon armament. Most other Spitfire variants mounted 2 cannons supplemented by either 4 .303 machine guns or .50 caliber weapons, the latter combination becoming the most common by 1943.
Squadron leader Sailor Milan, the South African ace credited with at least 35 victories, described the difference in characteristically direct terms. A .303 hit sounded like throwing gravel at a tin roof. A 20mm hit sounded like someone kicking a door off its hinges. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe crews was immediate and profound. German pilots, who had grown accustomed to absorbing machine gun fire and returning home, suddenly found themselves facing weapons that could destroy a fighter with 2 or 3 hits, or a bomber with half a dozen. Night fighter crews flying Beaufighters equipped with 4 cannon reported kills with burst lengths of 2 to 3 seconds, roughly 10 to 12 rounds total. The massive shells detonating inside an aircraft structure didn't just damage, they dismembered. Wings separated from fuselages, fuel tanks exploded, engines were torn from their mountings. The weapon proved particularly devastating in the ground attack role. Soft-skin vehicles, lorries, half-tracks, staff cars were simply obliterated. Railway locomotives could be disabled with sustained fire into the boiler. The Luftwaffe's attempts at equivalent armament told their own story. The NGFF cannon, whilst lighter than the Hispano at just 26 kilograms and firing at a respectable 540 rounds per minute, suffered from dramatically lower muzzle velocity, just 600 meters per second, compared to the Hispano's 850. This velocity deficit translated directly to reduced range and penetration. The MGFF's 60-round drum magazine, whilst adequate for short engagements, couldn't be replaced in flight. German engineers developed the Minengeschoss shell with extraordinary explosive effect, which excelled at destroying unarmored targets, but struggled against the increasingly armored Allied fighters. The Mauser MG-151/20, introduced from 1941 onwards to replace the MGFF, represented Germany's recognition that the original weapon was inadequate. The MG-151/20 was intermediate between the MGFF and the Hispano in most characteristics. It weighed 42 kilograms, identical to the Hispano. It fired at 740 rounds per minute, slightly faster. Its muzzle velocity of 805 meters per second fell between the MGFF's 600 and the Hispano's 850. It was by any measure an excellent weapon, but it arrived 2 years after the Hispano had entered RAF service, and German industry never achieved the production volumes Britain managed. American attempts to produce the Hispano proved even more problematic. Despite British willingness to share technical data and production techniques, American manufacturers struggled with the weapon throughout the war. The M1 variant proved so unreliable, with misfires so frequent that the weapon was essentially unusable, that all 56,410 units manufactured were scrapped. The improved M2, with a chamber shortened by 1 mm and various reliability improvements, remained sufficiently problematic that American pilots actively disliked it. The weapon jammed on average once every 1,500 rounds under ideal conditions, and twice that frequently in dusty environments. It proved especially troublesome at high altitude, where cold temperatures affected the mechanism. Production ran to well over 100,000 units, yet the vast majority were never installed in aircraft. The U.S. Army Air Forces largely abandoned the weapon, equipping their fighters with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns instead. The Navy persisted longer, recognizing the need for cannon firepower against Japanese bombers and later kamikaze attacks, but never achieved satisfactory reliability. Only after the war, with the introduction of the M3 version incorporating electrical cocking and other improvements, did American Hispano variants become genuinely dependable. The British, having given up on American production, concentrated on their own manufacturing. By 1943, every RAF fighter carried cannon as primary or supplementary armament. The Hawker Tempest and Typhoon mounted 4 Hispano Mk5, a shortened barrel, higher rate of fire variant that sacrificed some muzzle velocity for improved packaging and faster firing. The de Havilland Hornet, Gloucester Meteor, and other late-war designs standardized on 4-cannon armament with no machine guns whatsoever. The weapon's impact extended beyond simple kill statistics, though those were impressive enough. The Hispano cannon fundamentally altered tactical calculations. German bomber formations, previously confident in their defensive armor and self-sealing tanks, began requiring heavier fighter escorts. Night bomber operations became nearly suicidal once Beaufighters and Mosquitoes, guided by airborne radar, could intercept with cannon armament. The psychological weight of facing cannon-armed fighters eroded Luftwaffe morale throughout 1942 and 1943. Pilots who survived .303 fire but encountered